This game's a club game I played last season, and it was one of my favourite games of last year, just because everything was quite clear cut and most things seemed to go to plan in the game. And I'm playing white. My opponent is rated 164 ECF, which is 1962 ELO. And I opened with e4. My opponent went d6, and in this situation I was always going to seize the centre. I went with d4, played knight f6, developed the knight, defending the e4 pawn, g6, preparing to fianchetto, bishop to c4, bishop to g7, and here I play f3, protecting the e4 pawn some more, and also if I want to push g4 later, there's support for that as well, which g4 and h4 quite a common plan against a fianchettoed castled position. So black castles kingside. I bring a knight to e2. He develops his knight. Bishop comes out. e5. And I move a queen up, preparing to castle queenside, and also preparing a possible bishop to h6 and exchange off these bishops later. And here he plays queen to e7, but probably better would have been to take the pawn here, and when I recapture, bring his knight to e5. So he was centralizing his knight, and he's doing that with tempo because he's hitting his bishop. So I've got to do something about that, and bishop to b3 would be the obvious move there. But he plays queen to e7. I castle, and he plays a6, preparing b5. So he's preparing to expand on the queen side, and I do the same on the king side, h4. And then we see b5 gaining space and forcing me to make a decision as to where I'm going to put the bishop. I would have kept it along this diagonal with bishop to b3. I wanted it on that diagonal, particularly seeing as we've got the g6, the fianchettoed position, because if I was to take this pawn in future, say h5 and take the pawn there, this pawn's pinned, and so it can be a very useful piece of bishop on this diagonal. It will restrict black's defensive options. But it plays b5, and here I play the knight to d5, attacking the queen with the idea of if he takes with the knight, I'll bring the bishop into play. And I'm attacking the queen and the knight. Now if the queen was to go to e8 or e6, I'll just take on c7 and win in exchange. And if he's to capture with a knight, I'll recapture with the bishop, hitting this rook, rook b8, then h5, attacking his g6 pawn, only defended by this pawn. And if we saw perhaps knight f6, I'll take the pawn. When he recaptures, bishop h6, and he's going to be in a lot of danger down his h file. But anyway, we go back to this position, knight d5. So he plays the strongest move, which is a queen to d8, protecting his c7 pawn. And then I retreat the attack bishop to b3, keeping on that diagonal. So bishop to b7. And then we see bishop to g5. My opponent played c5, double threat here, winning a pawn on d4, and also just playing c4 and trapping his bishop. So we get pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, again threatening c4, knight takes knight, he recaptures with a knight, and then I just do a side step with a queen to e3, hitting the c5 pawn and discovering an attack on the queen. So he plays queen to c7, defending this. I saw a feature in this position that I could take advantage of, namely the d5 square. We've got a nice square on d5 that can't be attacked by the pawns because these have advanced to the same rank, and it's only this knight and bishop that are able to defend it for black. So if I got rid of this knight and exchange off these bishops, then that d5 square would be mine, and it would be an excellent post for this knight. So we see bishop takes knight, and the bishop recaptures, and the bishop d5. Now I really thought he was going to take the bishop and d5 himself, but he doesn't, in which case I'd recapture with a rook, with the idea of retreating a rook and moving a knight into that space at some point. But instead he moves a rook to the b file. So here I capture the bishop, he retakes with rook, and knight c3. Now if we look, knight d5 is going to be coming at some point, and none of his pieces can dislodge that knight, so that knight can stay on the central very strong d5 square for as long as it wants. Also this bishop, the only minor piece that it's left with, is restricted by his pawn on e5. So for the foreseeable future, my knight is going to be quite a bit more useful than his bishop. Now because knight d5 is obviously coming, and it will be attacking his queen and the bishop, he retreats the bishop and plays bishop to g7, which is quite a natural idea because you create the hole on g7 for the bishop in that fianchetto, but the bishop's going to be absolutely useless there. It's got 3 squares that it can move to, and only 2 of those are safe, and it's not really doing anything from either of them. It'd be better bringing his bishop to e7. So my knight can go to d5 at any time, so I'll play h5. Again attacking kingside. He plays b4, counter-attacking. The knight goes to d5, and he brings his queen over to a5. So he's threatening queen takes pawn, and also he's going to look at advancing the b and c pawns and trying to get his rooks into play to attack this position. If this pawn wasn't there and his bishop g7 was gunning down on b2 as well, then he'd have a very strong attack. Now my plan so far had always been to take on g6, but I noticed something about this position, and I just advance the h pawn to h6. Now clearly the bishop can't go to f6, so it's got to save itself, it's got to drop back to the corner. And now we can really see how this knight is dominating the position, and this bishop has become useless. Now if this rook wasn't on b7, I could play knight to e7 checkmate right now because the king can't move. So I'll play the queen to g5, threatening knight e7, and he'd have to give up his rook. But I'm also threatening knight f6. Knight f6 check, he'll have to give up a bishop, and when queen takes, he's not going to be able to prevent queen to g7 checkmate. And my opponent finds the only move that keeps him alive here, which is f6. Queen to g4, and we've got a couple more threats here. Now if black had just played queen takes a2, then we'd have queen to e6 check, and then if he played his rook, the b rook to f7, the knight e7 is checkmate. And if you play the other rook to f7, knight to e7 check, and if his rook takes here, we're checking the back rank, puts a piece in away, and that's checkmate again. Well, he doesn't play that, he plays the best move, rook to e8, protecting the e6 square. Then I've got to do something about the queen attacking a2 here, so king b1. And when he advances c4, he's got to attack where he's strong, and I played a queen to g3. Now the idea of this move was just to bring queen to f2 to help defend when he breaks through here. However, a better move would have been queen to h4 with the same idea, still giving me f2 to come back to, but then I've got a threat as well, knight takes f6. So queen to g3, and then he advances b3. So then you have to work out how to defend in this position. I realise that with me being able to defend on second rank could be okay here. So pawn takes pawn, pawn takes, because of course he's threatening queen takes a2 as well. And then here just a3. Now brings his rook over to c8, but this actually helps me, I think, because as I've got both rooks doubled here, I play rook to c1, neutralizing his threats down the c file, and if he takes on c1, which is what I was expecting him to do, then it's going to leave me with control of that file. Instead he plays good move, rook to c2, and the idea is that if I take this, it's going to open up for files on the king. And here I made a mistake. I should have played queen to e1, challenging the queen, but the idea is that if I bring a queen into play here, the queen will be covering a lot of squares and it will reduce his attacking possibilities. But I couldn't see anything wrong with me taking the rook, and there isn't. It just reduces my advantage, and we'll see why. Rook takes c2, he recaptures, and I take with the king. And then he plays queen check here, and I move back to b1. And then my opponent makes a mistake here. He plays queen takes pawn, which looks natural. He's got his pawn back and he's threatening checkmating one. We were quite short on time here. This was the 33rd move and we had to get to the 35th to meet time control, but this gives me ample opportunity to defend the position, and my position here, because of the activity of the pieces, is a lot better, so I was able to regain my advantage. So I played queen f2 just to defend against that checkmate. But the better move in this position was queen to d4. Now if we look at this, he's threatening checkmate again, but he's also guarding his f2 square, stopping me from getting back to defend it. So what do we do here? b4, and then queen d3, king b2, queen checks, and he's got a perpetual check because I haven't got this pawn to hide behind. But back to the game, queen f2, and as I say, we were running low on time, and he played a queen check, which I was pleased to see because I've just played queen to here, and I'm threatening not only his queen but also queen to c8 check, attacking this rook. So he exchanges queens and I recapture. Now materials level, but I've got this rather handy knight controlling lots of squares and space here, and his bishop is doing absolutely nothing. So he immediately tries to put that right by playing f5, trying to get this bishop out. I move my rook into play with tempo, attacking this weak pawn on a6. Now this can only be defended by the rook. Rook a7, and now we're clearly in the end game, and the plans change to something quite different from all the checkmate threats that we had before. And seeing as his king and bishop are completely offside, and he's only got this rook to protect his pawn, and his rook is unguarded, I can take advantage of that, and I start advancing my pawn b4. King f7, preparing, defending the f6 square so he can play bishop f6 and get his bishop into play. b5. Generally, if you can safely advance a pawn without risk of losing it, it's generally a good idea, especially in the end of the game. So we had b5, obviously he can't capture because his rook will be on pre, and I'm now threatening to win this pawn, so he plays a5, and then we'll get b6, defended by the knight. I'm forcing a rook to move. Rook a8. Now after b4, b5, b6, I did consider b7 to see if that was possible, and I decided on a more clear-cut plan to winning this endgame and getting that pawn promoted. As it turns out, could have played b7. The idea being that he moves a rook, I defend with my rook. We have a quick exchange of pawns there. Bishop f6 to get his bishop into the game. You can't really do a lot else here. Knight to c7. and then on the next move I bring a knight to a6 attacking a rook. But anyway, instead I played a king to b3, and the idea here is to a few threats to get the king all the way up here and help the promotion of the pawn, and to put pressure on this pawn, threatening to win the pawn with a king and a rook teaming up on it. And also by moving a king to the b file I can play rook c1 and c7 if needed. So then my opponent plays his bishop to f6, finally getting his bishop into play. Now there's quite an interesting moment here. My knight's been stronger than that bishop for the majority of the game, and he's still going to have trouble defending with that bishop, but I saw that I could just simplify things here, and I took the bishop. Knight takes bishop, king takes. Now if we look, his king is way over on the other side of the board, so king to c4, and then he decides that he's got to play king to g5 and try and create something over on the king side, but there's nothing going to be happening there. King to b5. Actually, I'll just go back one step and I'll show the very flash line that the computer pointed out afterwards. I could have taken the pawn with a rook here on a rook recaptured b7, and because the king's guarding these squares, the rook can't do anything about it, so we'd have rook a3 check, king back, rook a1. Now it looks as if I've queen here, but he can play rook b1 check and win a queen, so we just play the king back first, and when the rook moves get the queen. So that was quite a nice line, but I played the simpler king b5, takes on e4, I recapture, king f4, I take the pawn. Of course I'm attacking the rook now, so he has to move the rook, rook b8. Now time's definitely on my side, and I could have just advanced the rook up and got the king into play and forced this pawn through, or force him to give up the rook for the pawn. I played quite a practical move here. Rook a4. I know that I'm going to be able to get my king up to support the pawn's promotion, and also rook a4 just defending his pawn absolutely cuts off any counterplay or ideas and makes it much more difficult, and psychologically for the opponent it's a bit disheartening to know that you've basically got no hope. So he plays king g3 here, king goes forward, takes a pawn, king to c7, and he plays a rook to g8 here. Now it didn't really matter where he went here, but he played rook g8, and after b7 he realizes that he can't even check here, so he resigned. But for instance, if he had played rook f8, I'd play b7 anyway, rook f7 check, king b6, checks again, king to c5, stopping him coming to the b6 square, and if he drops back then we'll play rook a8, and he's going to have to exchange rooks and I get the queen. So there we go. Hope you enjoyed the game, and if you've got any comments please leave them below. Thanks for watching.